This episode of Student of the Game is brought to you by today's sponsor, Aura. Have you ever typed your name into Google and found it, way too easy to find your personal information? Well, like a Premier League club trying to sell their players to Saudi Arabia, data brokers sell that information to scammers, spammers, and anyone else who might want to target you. Your full name, email, home address, health records, your relatives, it's all out there. That's why I've been using Aura, the sponsor of today's video. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests for me, because I don't want any of those people selling my information. That's uncool. Cleaning up my information not only reduces the amount of spam I get, which is good because I hate that, but it also protects me from hackers who could use this information to help them access my social media accounts, bank accounts, or other sensitive information. Aura also does so much more to protect me and my family from online threats that I can't see, like a left tackle protecting my blind side. It's really easy to set up, so I don't have to download several different apps to get things like antivirus, VPN, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more. I get everything at one affordable price. You may already have one or two of these tools, but not having Aura is like locking the front door and leaving the back door wide open. Aura is always on, doing the hard work of keeping me safe so I can focus on other tasks, like making Student of the Game videos, with peace of mind. Privacy and protection are important to everyone. You can go to aura.com/game to start your 2-week free trial. Alright, on to the video.
Welcome back. I want to elaborate on an announcement made earlier today. You may have heard about this, that I'm going to leave the show in 2009. Okay. Right. No, let me explain. Let me explain how these things work.
In 2004, Jay Leno announced that he was leaving The Tonight Show and that Conan O'Brien would be taking over from him in 2009. Now, you may be wondering why any of that is relevant to a channel that focuses primarily on sports, but just stick with me for a minute. Anyway, after 5 years of telling people that he was on his way out, 2009 finally arrived and Jay Leno handed The Tonight Show over to Conan, which made a ton of sense. Conan's late night show, which he'd taken over from David Letterman in 1993, had endured a pretty rocky start to become a staple of NBC's programming, and by the mid-2000s, Conan himself was a hot commodity. On paper, it seemed like NBC had played this just about perfectly. Not only did they have a younger star lined up who could replace Leno when the time came, but they also had 5 years to make the transition as seamless as possible. But did it turn out that way? Well, let's just say we probably wouldn't be talking about it if it had. To make a long story short, The Tonight Show with Conan O'Brien turned into a PR disaster for NBC. One of their weirdest decisions came when they scheduled a new talk show for Leno that looked and sounded conspicuously like his old one that ended up competing directly with Conan's Tonight Show. Transitioning to a new host was never going to be easy, but NBC made it borderline impossible. Conan's ratings started to dip, and in a panic, NBC moved Leno's new show back to his old time slot, displacing The Tonight Show from its 11:35 start for the first time in over 50 years. This was the final straw for Conan, who threatened to leave if NBC didn't move the show back to its original start time. But the network had made up their minds. After just 8 months, The Tonight Show with Conan O'Brien was over, and Jay Leno was back in his old job. The idea of succession planning has fascinated me for a long time, so much so that I actually wrote a book about it a few years ago, and a lot of that comes back to this story. Why was it so hard for NBC to let go of Leno? Why did they panic after a few months of poor performance, much of which was due to their own decisions? The answer, I've realized, is that change is hard, and especially when the stakes are high, it makes people make decisions that they never would under normal circumstances. And that idea holds up pretty much regardless of what industry we're talking about. But in my opinion, nowhere is it truer than in the sports world. Finding out that a successful coach or player is leaving is enough to send anyone associated with that team into a panic. And in January 2024, we all found out that the greatest college football coach of all time and the greatest professional football coach of all time were both leaving their jobs on the same exact day. Succession planning is an attempt to get out ahead of all of this and take a measured, long-term approach to bringing in somebody new. For example, in the mid-2000s, several big-name college football coaches, like Florida State's Bobby Bowden and Texas's Mack Brown, were headed towards retirement. In anticipation of this, each of their programs named one of their assistants to be their coaches-in-waiting, who would take over when the head coaches decided to call it quits. Sound familiar? Because it should. In theory, this was a great idea for a couple of reasons. Not only would having a replacement lined up cut out a lot of the drama about who would come after, but would also give the new coach as much time as they needed to get to know the program. Again, in theory, this was a very logical approach to a difficult problem. evidenced by the fact that there were a whole bunch of these guys in the exact same situation in the college football world around that time. But over a decade later, it's pretty clear that with a couple of notable exceptions, the hit rate on the coach in waiting thing, or as I like to refer to it, the Conan O'Brien protocol, was not awesome, and as a result, no one's really tried it in quite the same way since. There's an argument to be made that as much as continuity can be helpful, if you're trying to make a clean transition to a new idea, deliberately holding on to parts of the old one may not be a great plan. But what if you could keep the broad concepts of the old regime in place while also bringing in someone from the outside? This version of succession planning is known as the hand-picked successor model, where the incumbent leader is responsible for choosing exactly who will replace them. It's a more short-term approach than the Conan O'Brien model, but it's also one that could potentially empower the new hire more than spending a bunch of time underneath the other guy's wing. To get a good look at it though, we're going to have to switch sports. And continents. In 2013, legendary Manchester United manager Sir Alex Ferguson announced that he was going to retire after 26 years with the club, and that Everton manager David Moyes was going to replace him. In Moyes' words, Ferguson wanted him to be his replacement so badly that he pretty much just told him that he was going to take the job. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And United could have done a lot worse than Moyes. He'd taken over Everton in the early 2000s, during one of the toughest periods in club history. Slowly but surely worked them up to being consistent qualifiers for European competitions. It wasn't the flashiest hire they could have made, but it was certainly sensible. It could have been a chance for United to transition one managerial regime directly into another, but after just a few months, it became clear that that was not going to be the case. In 2013, Manchester United was not the kind of club where any manager was going to be afforded a ton of time, no matter who had chosen them to be there. United had won 5 of the previous 7 Premier League titles going into that season, and 13 in the 26 years that Ferguson had been in charge there. So when Moyes' team only won 2 of their first 6 games and were in 7th place by Christmas, the pitchforks were already out and actively being sharpened. Despite Moyes' many years of experience managing in the Premier League, and the fact that his win percentage at United wasn't actually that much different than a lot of the managers who had come after him, there did appear to be an issue in terms of scaling his philosophy up to a bigger job. Some would argue that that issue hasn't gone away. But on April 22nd, after a 2-0 loss to Moyes' old team, Everton, Manchester United sacked him before he could even complete his first season with the club. With succession planning, there's a concrete attempt to blend one era into the next in the hope that the transition won't be so jarring that everything falls apart. But either consciously or subconsciously, you're also keeping the expectations and norms that came from the old era around for the new one, especially if the old coach is still kind of hanging around the team, which in a lot of these cases, they are. From the boardroom to the stands and even down to the field itself, in order to successfully transition into a new era, you have to give the new person room to put their unique imprint on the project. And sometimes, the best way to do that is with a good, clean break. It's not actually that common to see a legendary figure replaced by someone from completely outside their sphere of influence. Especially after having so much success, you can understand the impulse to try and keep things at least somewhat the same. But in 1998, Jerry Krause and the Chicago Bulls made the kind of bold move that characterized them as an organization during that time period. Phil Jackson's team had won 6 out of 8 titles in the 90s, behind Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, but as that group was breaking up, Krause chose to replace Jackson with Tim Floyd, then the head coach at Iowa State. In terms of a culture change, this was about the biggest leap that the team could have possibly made. Not only was Floyd not an established NBA coach, he had never coached in the NBA at all, but there he was, getting the keys to the Bulls' new kingdom, in the hope that his energy and fresh ideas would reinvigorate the franchise as they transitioned into a new era. And as a concept, I think I may like this approach the best. Teams and fans are going to have a hard time making the adjustment to the new person in charge regardless, so you might as well just double down on that and tear the band-aid off. But it's also definitely the riskiest way to do it. If things go wrong, not only have you gone back to square one, but you've also pissed off your support base and made the next transition that much harder in the process. Tim Floyd had a win percentage of just over 200 in his time with the Bulls, which lasted more than 3 seasons. 3.5 years of winning 2 games out of every 10, directly after a run where they made the playoffs 14 years in a row and won 6 championships. Replacement hiring is hard precisely because of the nature of what you're trying to do. You're either going to have to go down the Tim Floyd route and tear everything down to replace it with something completely different, or you're going to bring in the next best thing to create a kind of weird facsimile of whatever you had before. Either way, you can't really replace everything that the person brought to the organization, either in the results on the field or the emotional connection they had with the fans. It's impossible, or at least impossible to do quickly. But as we've established, patience isn't something that the people making these decisions tend to have an awful lot of. All of these issues have the potential to completely ruin the short, medium, and potentially long-term future of organizations like the Patriots and Alabama football. But it absolutely does not stop there. Eventually, the Spurs are going to have to figure out what they're going to do after Greg Popovich. Man City and Liverpool have been the best-run clubs in England for the better part of a decade now, but Pep Guardiola and Jurgen Klopp aren't going to be there forever. As long as there are good coaches out there will always be a need to plan for what to do when they decide to move on, and a distinct risk of doing it extremely poorly. So what do you do? I've looked at a couple of literature reviews on succession planning in big organizations, and there are a few practical insights that come up in pretty much all of them. The first is that no matter how good the leader is, the culture and leadership of the organization should extend past just one person. In a lot of the cases we've looked at, way too much power and influence was consolidated into one person's job. So when they were suddenly removed, it created a leadership vacuum that many of them are still trying to fill. Contrast that with a club like Brighton in the Premier League. They lost their transformative manager, Graham Potter, and like half of their front office to Chelsea in 2022. But because their club identity and infrastructure were so strong, they just hired the next guy and kept on rolling. Organizational checks and balances are a good thing. It may start from the top, but if you've got a comprehensive structure and culture in place, you're going to be able to survive a change in leadership a lot more smoothly. The second big insight is that the outgoing coach absolutely has a role to play in doing this well. You have to be a little careful with this one, because clearly there is a risk of that presence looming a little too large over the new person, but if they're doing their jobs well, a great leader has the power to set their organization up to succeed after he or she leaves it. This applies in all three of the scenarios we've already discussed. Whether they've been grooming their replacement for a long time, they had a hand in picking exactly who would come in after them, or they're dealing with someone completely new, the outgoing leader can absolutely be a positive influence on establishing the new one. But the most important thing that teams can do is realize that replacing a coach is not something that should be done all at once. It seems silly to say that anyone would get caught by surprise when a person who's had a job for a really long time decides to retire, but I really do think that there's an element of that in a lot of these cases. It's one thing to know intellectually that an aging coach might be on the way out soon, but it's quite another to really be ready for it in the ways that matter. It behooves these teams to have an idea of what's coming next years before they actually need one, and to keep coming back to that idea periodically. You have to always be looking ahead, so that when the time comes, you aren't the ones getting left behind. I recognize that what I'm describing is incredibly difficult to do well. It takes years of planning, a lot of buy-in, and a pretty healthy amount of luck to be able to hire two successful coaches in a row under any circumstances, but especially so if one of those coaches is an all-time great. And for the record, I actually really like what both Alabama and the Patriots have done to replace their head coaches. In their own ways, Kalen DeBoer and Gerard Mayo are both progressive, sensible appointments. But does that mean that they're going to be able to carry all that success forward? I have no idea. Literally none, because this is not something you can test in a lab. Our brains are weird and prone to biases and emotions and impulses, and the science of decision-making has to be studied with all of those things very much at the center of it. The experiment has to be done in real time, with real stakes and potentially real consequences if things don't go well. Legendary sports figures are so because their accomplishments are so self-evident. They are undeniable. They are certain. But figuring out how to replace them is anything but. Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Really does mean a lot. My name is Will, and this is my channel, Student of the Game, where we talk about anything related to sports psychology and culture. It's no secret that I'm an Alabama fan, and as such, it's been a pretty trying couple of weeks. But that was made worse by the fact that I found out that Nick Saban was retiring while I was in line at Chipotle. Literally just checked Twitter right before I was about to order, and bam! Instant sadness. I've been reminding myself ever since to not cry because it's over, but to instead smile because it happened. This video is over though, so if you enjoyed it and would like to let me know, please do give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. See you next time.